Good afternoon, and thanks for joining this last compensation committee webinar for 2023. I'm Rob Galford. I'll be guiding today's discussion, and we're going to be exploring two different tools that the board can use to improve its composition, its culture, and its performance. As you will very likely know, this year's Blue Ribbon Commission from NACD focused on this very thing, guiding directors to build and maintain a high-performance board. If you have not seen that report quite yet, I highly recommend it. I also served on that commission with Jan Coors of Perlmutter, and today two of her colleagues, Ryan Horahan and Elise Walton, are with us to talk about the practicalities of deploying a director compensation and board assessment strategy in ways that really do help us achieve that goal. This guidance can help directors move from exploration and conversation to action, and that's really what we'd like to do. But before we get to the specifics, I'm going to ask Mary Canizales from NACD to have a few housekeeping items under her purview to bring us forward. So over to you there, Mary.
Thank you much, Rob, and thank you and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As Rob mentioned, I'd like to get through a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. First and foremost, we want to hear from you. Our experts want to hear from you. And so if you want, we'd love for you to submit your questions by adding them into the Q&A section of the webinar portal. We have built in a little bit of time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. And so we'd love to address those questions then. But if we, for some reason, don't get a chance to answer your question, don't fret. One of our friends at Perlmutter will respond to you directly in the next couple days. However, what that means, though, is by submitting a question, you are giving permission to Perlmutter to contact you after the webinar. The number one question that we always get, look, we're going to get to it, is that whether or not these slides are going to be available after the webinar and whether this webinar is going to be available afterwards. As always, we will have a recording of this webinar early next week, both on nacd.org webinars and at perlmutter.com. You can also access the slides and additional thought leadership provided by our speakers here in the additional resources section and in your post-webinar emails. On the next slide, I just want to remind our certified directors and board director fellows that your participation today actually provides you another credit towards maintaining your NACD credential. Our NACD fellows and certified directors will automatically receive their 1 credit. But please note, you must attend this webinar for at least 50 minutes to receive that credit. Speaking of our certification program, if you're interested in learning more and setting yourself apart as a high performance director, this is an amazing designation to do that. So check out our webpage or contact your membership advisor at credentialing@nacdonline.org. Finally, in the end, we have a few evaluation questions. It shouldn't take you very long, but we would really appreciate your feedback because we want to make sure that these webinars and all of our stuff is really insightful for you and that is that's really things that you are looking for. Help us by letting us know how we can improve, what you're looking to listen for, or what you're looking for in our programs. So, Rob, I want to get it back to you because that's really what they're here to hear.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you, Mary. I get the feeling you've done this once or twice before, so I think we're probably in pretty good shape at this point. And hello again to all of you, the several hundred of you who are with us for this next hour or so. We're going to try to do our best to make it as useful and valuable for you as possible. I'm taking a wild guess that just by being here, a goodly number of you are relatively frequent readers on topics of leadership, management, and governance. So if I say the name of the late Peter Drucker, it may be familiar to many of you because he was really one of the most enduring stars in this pantheon of business writing. And Peter Drucker used to start his sessions almost the exact same way he wrote, and he would ask people, what is our business and what should our business be? Emphasis on the word our, of course. And to borrow his approach and bring it forward here, even though he's been gone for a few decades now, the questions before us are kind of derivative of that question, which is what is our board culture and what should our board culture be? And now we can and should add a third question, which is how do we put this into practice? It's not as easy a question to answer, and this is one of the hopes for this particular hour or so we have with the folks from Perlmutter. earlier this week, in fact, NASDAQ released a research survey they had just conducted where it was identified that some 90% of boards do have some form of assessment or board evaluation. And that I think is a good, robust number, at least for the other 10%. It's an interesting question. Why not? But one of the things the NASDAQ survey revealed was 90% of boards had the assessment, but the number of boards that board members felt it was put into action was 7%. Just imagine that. 90% of us are doing it, and 90% of our boards are doing it, yet only 7% of them are thinking this is going into action. So if there were ever a call for action, this would be it. How do we build and reinforce and put it into practice an enduring board culture? And what tools are there which really will aid us do that? And as a commission, we spent a fair amount of time assisted by, and actually aided, more led by, I should say, a truly crackerjack group of people, the staff from NACD, who helped us start to focus on that final set of questions. What are the tools? And that's where we are with you folks today. Board assessment, the concrete data about our activities, our performance, and compensation really have showed themselves as two of the more applicable tools for us to apply. And that's why we are here, and that's why you are here, I would hope. And that's why, even better than that, we have both Ryan Hurahan and Elise Walton from Pearl Meyer. So the best thing I can possibly do now is to be quiet, at least for a while, much as that is not my usual state. I'm going to do my best because we've got a lot to hear about from these good folks. So with that, moving us from exploration and conversation to action, over to you, Ryan.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, and thank you to everybody that is joining the conversation today. As Rob said, I will be touching on compensation, around director compensation, to be more precise. And as most of you know, a topic that's been fairly routine, maybe a little boring over the past, handful of years, is something that we're starting to get a little bit more invigorated about here at Pearl Meyer, and I think seeing a little bit more movement in the marketplace as the board, the culture of the board, the responsibilities that stakeholders are putting on the board continue to evolve. So with that, you can move on to the next slide. Something we've been talking about, I feel now, for at least the last 12 to 18, possibly 24 months, is just kind of this continued expansion of responsibility at the board level. I think, most of the individuals on the call would agree, in today's kind of more volatile environment, high-performing boards need the ability to adapt and keep pace with shifting organizational needs. This is often dependent on having a strong mix of institutional knowledge, evolving skills and experiences, and fresh insights. So what does that mean? It's really trying to kind of find that right inflection point between, longer tenured directors that have strong institutional knowledge with kind of a fresh batch of directors that might bring some, fresh insights and thoughts to the boardroom. Again, as we look several years ago, topics like cybersecurity, AI, to a lesser extent, DEI and ESG, sustainability, they were not necessarily board topics, or not consistent board topics. I think what we're finding nowadays is these topics have a seat at the table pretty much at every board or committee meeting, depending on where that responsibility sits. So again, these topics are really becoming front and center. And as a result of kind of this additional responsibility and expansion of, shareholder expectations, boards are expanding their roles to address these topics, and not only assessing responsibilities to existing committees, but also starting to form new committees. So 75% in our recent data of the S&P 500 firms now have more than 3 established committees that are required by the stock exchange listings. 36% have 4, 21% have 5, and 13% have 6. And when it comes to the allocation of ESG responsibilities, virtually all S&P 500 firms are disclosing assignment of responsibilities to either the full board or one or more committees. And just, again, kind of piggybacking on that thought, I've certainly, amongst my clients, and, Rob, I'd be interested to get your kind of feedback on this as well, is, in addition to kind of identifying additional committees and establishing those committees, is really taking a lens at existing charters for the current committees that exist to make sure, do the charters that we have in place historically still kind of pass the muster given the environment today and the responsibility today? So I have had a lot of work over the last 12 months in terms of, refining comp committee charters. And it certainly extends beyond the comp committee. But Rob, I'd love to hear your experience or just your perspective on, whether or not the establishment of these committees makes sense, or whether or not you think maybe some of these topics make more sense under the purview of the entirety of the board, and also any experience you may have regarding kind of this evolution of committee charters.
Right. It's a good question, and there is a double-edged sword in the sense that, yes, you want certain things really well attended to, and query whether it's through let's establish another committee, or whether we go into charter creep. And those essentially are, or alternative three, or option three really is this something really which is truly board worthy? And while there's a value in having committees focus on certain things and perhaps do some of the prep work, I think there are certain topics that really are hard to allocate to, or hard to assign to a committee and get a really high integrity result. Very frankly, my view on that one, DEI, that's a board, that should be in my view, it is a board level issue. To me, it is one of these things that you just don't want to sort of try to assign elsewhere. I think that's one that really does require it, because, one of our fellow commissioners, Stephanie Creary, spends a lot of time looking at this very question on how you generate levels of involvement. And for those kinds of issues, you need a full committee.
Yeah.
No, sorry, not a full committee, a full board. A full board. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think I very much agree on the DEI point. I think that is really under the full board's purview in order to have a consistent kind of message across the organization.
Yeah, otherwise it gets categorized, shunted off, and maybe we don't have time to talk about it this month.
Well, yeah, back to your original point, maybe it's talked about, but as a 7% taking action, if it sits at the committee level, maybe that's even more reason to bring it under the full board's purview. Next slide, please. So board turnover, another, fairly hot topic in today's kind of environment. And as I alluded to on the previous slide, that perfect kind of constituent as you step back and look at a board would comprise of kind of your tenured directors, as well as kind of a fresh group of ideas. So probably some less tenured directors. And really, how do you facilitate that with some board turnover? So again, with the evolving landscape, I think most shareholders are expecting a healthy amount of planned board turnover. So again, not knee-jerk turnover, but planned board turnover. To address the need of board refreshment, companies have increasingly relied on mandatory retirement policies. I want to say when Perlmutter looked at this in the mid to late 1990s, less than 20% of the S&P 500 had mandatory retirement ages in place for their board of directors. I think in the most recent pass of this, that number was north of 80%. So we are certainly seeing a push in the direction of, how do we facilitate turnover? I think, again, the path of least resistance from most companies' perspective is let's put in place kind of a mandatory retirement policy. I think from our perspective at Perlmutter, thoughtful boards are likely to devise a carrot to accompany the stick. So, again, not just implying that we're just throwing in this retirement age, but maybe there's some thought behind how we're structuring the mandatory retirement and how we're structuring compensation to kind of blend into that. So again, as we think about board turnover, we're encouraging boards to kind of step back and ask themselves a few questions as you think about refreshment. And how does a board, and this is both from a policy standpoint as well as a compensation standpoint, encourage and support a culture of routine refreshment, increase more frequent rotation of committee members, fairly treat individual directors who will be leaving as a result of a turnover exercise. So whether that means equity vesting, whatever that means from a compensation perspective. And then I think this last point is becoming increasingly important, especially as some of those points I alluded to on the previous slide in terms of topics that are now kind of at the forefront of the board, that were topics that were not really thought about, as I say, 5 to 10 years ago, cybersecurity, AI, that traditionally needs some non-traditional director candidates as kind of quote unquote expert in those areas. Again, Rob, I'll kind of pose a question to you quickly. And in this last bullet, this idea of attracting non-traditional director candidates, I've certainly seen a push from my clients to start kind of operating in this space, given some, not only the considerations on the previous slide in terms of additional topics, but also diversity requirements and some other things that have come to the forefront over the last several years. So any insights from your perspective on, as you think about attracting non-traditional directors, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the materials, but just would love to get your insight on that.
Just a quick insight or two. First of all, I think on the overall category of board turnover, even before we talk about non-traditionals, is this question of expectations management. That if you lay out these things, if you say, look, our traditional amount of time for someone to be on a board is X, whether it's 3 or 6 years, 9 years, 12 years, what's right for your entity is important. Otherwise, you're going to have people who say, well, as long as I'm adding value, I should stay on the board. And that is true, except I think every director believes that they are adding value. So some element, and well, they should. And at the same time, some expectations management to say our board is generally made up of people with an average tenure of X. I also think what that helps people do is it helps them get away from the age thing, because once you start to put an age requirement in there, whatever it is, you make it 65 or 68 or 70. Funny how easy it is to change that to keep some more directors around if they will lobby for. So I would be encouraging more of thinking about this as what's the expectation for someone's time on a board. And in fact, our friends in England, as you well know, after 9 years, you're not even considered an independent director under UK director kind of regulations. And what that I think also helps people do is it helps bring on more candidates. And whether we're talking about skills or source or diversity, those non-traditional candidates are extraordinarily valuable. I had one board recently where the CEO simply said, I want to surround myself with CEOs. They're the only ones who've been in my seat. And if the board is going to be helpful to me, I want them to have that perspective. Well, it took a little while to disabuse them of the notion that not everybody had to have that CEO title. But they came along rather quickly. And I think what you then find is that when you go a couple of levels down further into organizations, whether someone is the head of a division or doing has a head of a particular function, they add tremendous value, both from the standpoint of that skill set and from the standpoint of new blood. So, there's much to be had there. I mean, right now, sort of the shame on us is if you look at it, we have 2 female directors, 2 Black female directors in the entire Fortune 500. Who are CEOs. I beg your pardon. Let me correct that. So if we can have 2 Black female CEOs in the 500 CEO slots, there are not going to be a lot of other, let's call them Black female CEOs available for other board seats, whether we're looking at that at a level standpoint or just across the organization. So attracting those non-traditional director candidates, particularly when it comes to skill set and years of experience, I think we do ourselves a favor by taking a gamble every now and then.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I really appreciate the insight, Rob. And I think your point on kind of setting the expectation regarding turnover and what that trajectory looks like kind of at the forefront rather than on the back end and constantly pivoting on the back end to accommodate is certainly what we would recommend at Perlmutter as well. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this at the onset of the conversation in regards to board compensation being, fairly rote and a little boring over the last couple of years. Now, we are starting to see with some of this idea of, board evolution from a purview perspective as well as a constituent perspective start to evolve a little bit. So again, I think from a, cash kind of retainer perspective or kind of annual cash perspective, we're certainly seeing annual cash retainers continue to be a very prevalently used vehicle. We're actually seeing meeting fees being absorbed largely in those annual cash retainers and falling off for the most part. I think the feeling is, a focus on retainer versus meeting fees reflects a little bit more fluidity in communication amongst board members, management, and advisors. You don't have these conversations that says, well, did that constitute a meeting? Did that not constitute a meeting? And you're kind of constantly running the clock. So again, I think meeting fees is something that we are certainly seeing fall kind of by the wayside and largely being gobbled up kind of in that annual cash retainer. Again, committee chair compensation in terms of incremental committee chair compensation, still a very highly prevalent practice and something we expect to continue to see growing, especially as these committees are tasked with additional responsibilities. Additional pay for committee members is decreasing a little bit. And again, I think if you think about why that's happening, I think, again, some of that committee membership fee is being rerouted more into the annual cash retainer. And I think it's largely driven by the fact that by eliminating those committee member pays, it facilitates a little bit easier committee rotation and refreshment without kind of the compensation consequences that might come with it. So if I move from, let's say, audit to nom and gov, I'm not going there and going, oh, shucks, I'm now making $10,000 less in my annual, cash because my committee retainer for the nom and gov committee is less than it would have been for audit. So I think you're starting to see some of that being massaged out of the director comp program. And as I said, that baked in a little bit more to the idea of let's just move those dollars into the annual cash retainer. Majority of public companies continue to rely on restricted stock versus options. Annual grants typically determined so again, dollar value grants, not share grants. And grants are often made at the annual meeting date with 1 year vesting. So not much change there. We have seen, I will say, some companies, just given the volatility in stock price over the last 12 to 18 months, deviate slightly from the dollar value determination of grants and sometimes move to share denomination of awards. Why? Because if I have a stock price that's constantly bouncing up and down, and when it comes to make my director equity grants, the stock price is tremendously depressed and I'm doing a dollar value, I often have to grant far more shares at that point in time. So if I use a share-based approach, it can sometimes mitigate that. In regards to share ownership guidelines, again, I think we're continuing to see the prevalence in share ownership guidelines across the director rise. It's pretty much, prevalent, if not 100% used amongst the top 200 companies. Some companies have holding requirements limiting a director's ability to sell all or a portion of shares during their tenure. Now, again, I think some companies have put in these holding requirements to expedite the board turnover a little bit, because again, if I'm establishing a holding requirement and directors don't have any access to constructively receive dollars associated with their equity grants, it could expedite or hasten their desire to step off of the board. So I think that is a circumvent somewhat to board refreshment. And then regarding payments, again, I think NACD standard and Pearl Myers expectation is that more than 50% of director compensation should be delivered in the form of equity. I think we're also seeing more firms allow the deferral of the cash component of director compensation into the equity vehicle, optional, not mandatory, but allowing that optional deferral from cash to equity is something that we've also seen become more prevalent. Next slide. As we think about using board compensation as a tool for change, I think there's, again, as you look at the left side of this chart, it's kind of saying, okay, depending on what the board wants and from an outcome perspective, here are some things to consider. I think if thinking about these things will allow smoother transitions between incoming and outgoing directors. So again, as we think about it, back to the point Rob was speaking on earlier, attracting non-traditional directors. What are some considerations from a compensation perspective if I want to attract some non-traditional directors to my board? Offer relatively higher cash compensation. As Rob said, they might not be sitting CEOs of other corporations, meaning the director compensation is a little bit more meaningful than it might be to somebody that's already built a high net worth as a CEO or something of another company. Include initial equity awards. I think we kind of saw a teetering off of initial equity a little bit over the last couple of years. I think we're starting to see it come back a little bit for this exact reason is if I can include some initial equity awards, it's kind of an attractive piece to get somebody that might not have been necessarily that interested in board service to say, let me throw my hat in the ring, and those kind of ideas. So again, I think initial equity awards are something we expect to kind of continue to evolve as non-traditional directors, become more sought after. And then adopt more modest share ownership guidelines. So allow, some burn and churn. I'm not saying a tremendous amount of burn and churn, but allow some burn and churn regarding equity director compensation. Now, Rob, I saw you came off mute. I didn't know if you wanted to chime in.
Not yet. You're doing
Not yet.
great.
All right, fantastic. Encourage tenured directors to retire. Set minimal vesting periods for equity grants. Implement hold to retirement requirements for equity. So as we alluded to on the previous slide, this hold to requirement or very short vesting periods, meaning they're vested at time of grant, but you have to hold, is all things that have been kind of used to encourage tenured directors to retire. What if you want to retain tenured directors with key institutional knowledge? Provide share ownership guideline relief for directors who reach a certain age or year of service. So again, if I have ownership guidelines in place and I want to keep a director that's been long tenured on the board and they're looking down and saying, geez, I'd love to commoditize some of this equity, maybe you loosen some of the standards on the ownership guideline to allow them to do so. And then increase formal and or more frequent rotation of committee members. Again, I alluded to this a little bit when we were talking on the previous slide, but eliminate committee membership compensation and increase the board cash retainer. So again, kind of get out of that idea that, and I'm not saying at the chair level to remove the committee compensation, I'm saying at the membership level to move those dollars more into the annual cash retainer and rely less on committee member compensation. Next slide, please. So communicating the board's worth, as for most of the individuals on the call that are familiar with proxy disclosures, when you look at the executive compensation disclosed in a CD&A, it's generally a few-page narrative. It's fairly well laid out. They talk strategy, they talk accomplishments over the previous year. When you look traditionally at director compensation, it's usually a paragraph or two that's kind of buried more in the frontish end, let's say, of the proxy statement. And I think, what we're saying is that, I think having a little bit more narrative that can be, again, succinct and straightforward. We're not saying, stepping around that, but then talks to kind of these four buckets as we think about not only executive compensation, but director compensation. So the first would be goals. What is the philosophy, guiding principles, and objectives that are designing the pay program? Often you see this on the executive comp. Very rarely you see this on director comp. Design, provide an overview of pay mix structure, explain why it aligns with shareholder interests and how it supports a positive board culture and optimal refreshment cycles. Again, I think you often see the overview of the pay mix, but you very rarely see kind of those additional points on the back end of this, which is how does it align with shareholder interests? How does it support the board culture? How does it align with refreshment? Rationale. So again, summarize guiding principles of the program. What do we do? Why we do it? And why do we not do the things that we don't do? And then governance. Explain how the decisions are made. And I know we're talking CD&A and disclosures, but again, a lot of and I work with a lot of private companies too. A lot of my private companies, we encourage to do the exact same thing, even though it's not necessarily out there as a public form as a proxy would be. We just feel it's a great exercise to kind of, again, document the rationale. Always helps inform directors with the logic behind their compensation and highlights the board's thoughtful approach to the subject. And I think that's just a good exercise for any board to undertake. Next slide.
Next slide.
With that, I will pass it over to my esteemed colleague, Elise, who will walk through, the idea of board assessment and how that can drive continuous improvement. So Elise, with no further ado.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. That was really
Absolutely.
helpful. And in fact, as I said earlier in our pre-call, I'm glad to hear about the decrease in the use of meeting fees, because last month I was talking to a CEO who basically said, I want to call the non-gov committee together, but they're going to ask for a couple $1,000s just for meeting fees. And, it seems like, why do I have to do that? And what's preferable is to have share of mind versus paying for time. So I'm pleased to hear about that change and what boards are getting paid for. Let me, next slide. Let's just get started here with talking about how we think about board assessments. This is a really simple picture on board building framework. It's a basic design concept where you try to say, what should the board contribute? What is the purpose of this board? What is it trying to do? What should be the focus and scope? And that would include what topics. It also includes the capacity. What are the time, skills, and ability of the board to work together, as well as external issues that may drive the focus and scope of the board. And when you look at kind of what you're trying to get done with a board, or what's possible to get done with a board, you have your board practices in terms of how you actually run it. There are some things that are fixed, like the board design, the directors you currently have on the board, the structure or framework of the organization. And then there are things you can look at, like board dynamics, like the protocol, which is some things that might be written in your bylaws, but often there are things that are not. Some boards start with a review of their safety report to reinforce the importance of safety. Some boards open with a refresh of the mission. Those are things that are just practice, not necessarily formally written up. But it's interesting, as we talk more about culture and board assessment, we'll have some good examples on how board assessment can uncover some aspects of culture and protocols. Also, your agenda, what are your topics? What are you talking about? And the level of engagement that's expected of board members. So those are the kinds of things in the dynamics aspect that can affect how the board performs. The idea is you bring together the hard factors, the soft factors, and you create a value-added engagement. And of course, you assess your performance and your quality, and that gives feedback to improve what the board should and can contribute. Next slide. So one of the things when we're working with boards is we like to ask this question. It's a nice hack. And what we're going to do is ask you this question. Let me just take a second to go across this continuum. So there's something that's called the passive board that really functions at the discretion of the CEO, a certifying board, which does the due diligence of ensuring that the work is appropriate and sound, but mostly is certifying management actions. The engaged board, where it's more of a partnership with the CEO, an intervening board, which may be a crisis situation, but it also may be a different kind of organization. And last, the operating board, where the board is very heavily involved and makes key decisions and oftentimes may step in to help management. So on the operating board, and I know that several of the folks on this call, while you may be on public company boards, you've also served on nonprofit and public sector boards and association boards, and all those have different frameworks and may lead to different requirements and determinants for how engaged your board should be. And you may sit on boards that have hundreds of members, which you know that you're not going to be an operating board. So let's just go to a poll question quickly. I want to try this hack out with our attendees today. Next slide, please, or poll question, please. These are the questions we want to ask. What would you call the current environment? Think of one board that you're on. What would be the current environment of that board at this time? And then what do you think the ideal should be of the board? So let's just run these two questions if we can. Is it Eleanor? So let's take a quick look at the results. Poll 1 is up. The current environment. All right.
This is where we need the music.
That's right, the music. Or we could tell some stories about assessments, but let's see. Do we get all the responses into one and then maybe move on to 2?
Okay.
And I'm still seeing the question. So
Well, on to question 2.
Well, we have okay, here we go. So we have question 2. We see that actually, interestingly, 70% say that the board is engaged, and with 7% operating, 5%. We are not seeing poll 1, but it looks like actually the large majority is describing their board as engaged, which is really positive to see.
That is poll 1.
That is poll 1. I'm sorry.
Poll 1. Right.
Thank you. We're trying to navigate the feedback here. And interesting. So I'm presuming that you can see what we're seeing, and what we see is actually what you often find with boards when we do this with live boards, is that there is the ideal of an engaged board is pretty much the preferred model for working as a board. For a lot of other reasons, that isn't the case. That may not be the case at any given time. But one of the reasons why this is a useful hack is that what happens is people will sort of look to the middle and say, yes, the engaged board is the ideal, but you'll find oftentimes that maybe some board members feel that they're more leaning towards certifying, not really getting as much information or digging as deep as they might like, while management may often feel that you're intervening, that the board is more towards the intervening. The benefit is you get a chance to talk about what are the clues, what are the signals that are telling you that you need to be more engaged or you're not engaged in the right way. So I would encourage all of you to ask these questions, current and ideal, of your board, and see what insights you can gain from that in terms of the expectations and norms around engagement of your particular board. So with that, let's maybe move on to the next one. And this is a little bit just to undo the logic of singular choices. This demonstrates that the ideal going forward is more of an agile board. So this looks at how boards have evolved. And if you've been involved in boards for some time, then you're aware that 20 years ago or so, boards were primarily management-led. The agenda was set by management. Many of the members on the board would not be considered independent, and there was very limited board time, limited board expectations, and much less reporting. That's moved to the idea of a strategic board or engaged board, where the board is set jointly, the agenda is set jointly, and that's something where the board is really viewed as a strategic asset, actually helping the organization. Then that moves forward now to what we're calling the agile board, where again, the agenda is set jointly, but there's the ability to lean in as needed and lean out when it's appropriate, which, by the way, is one of the struggles that boards have, is that when you have a big event, a crisis or a leadership transition or a major acquisition, it often amplifies the demand on the board. And then when that event goes away, you now find that you have to dial back and be more of a regular operating engaged board. And there's managing that sense of like, well, what do we have to do now is sometimes a challenge when a board has been very engaged to move back to being more of the norm of engagement. So that's what we see is moving forward to the agile board. Now, next slide, please. Looking at the time here. As you hopefully have all gotten your copy and have read it, you know that one of the great benefits of board assessment is to help identify the culture that you want to have. And that is one of the things that we recommend and we do try to ascertain is the board's culture fit for purpose? So there are aspects of culture that may seem insignificant. Some are significant, but you want to be sure that the culture of the board is well fit for the demands on the board and what it has to do. And that the board should very explicitly consider cultural norms and expected director behavior, and that all board members have to champion and live the culture. And, you know, it's very interesting as Robbie started off talking about diverse directors. One of the things that happens as boards are incorporating, and executive management is also incorporating more diversity into its ranks, you'll find that the norms and expectations are not the same by people who are coming in from different backgrounds. And I can tell maybe an illustrative story about a board that had a new director, very accomplished entrepreneur, very well regarded, but there was some discomfort when he showed up. And it turns out that the discomfort was caused because he was wearing flip-flops. Now, nowhere in the director guidelines did it say no flip-flops in board meetings. And nobody had ever thought that that was a norm of the board until it became something that was noticed as out of bounds. So one thing that a board assessment can really help with is identifying where some of those norms may exist and may have conflicted with new directors in ways you want to explore as opposed to just assert, meaning that there may be norms that you have that are no longer suitable for a modern board. There may be norms that you have that are legacy. There may be new norms you want to incorporate. So building a culture that's fit for purpose, and particularly as boards are trying to incorporate greater diversity, is really important to keep as part of the remit for board assessment. I would say to the next slide, please. And pop questions in here. So when you're thinking about board assessment, we sort of look at these three questions as like, what are you going to assess? How are you going to assess it? And who will be doing the assessing? Let's just start with on what to assess. It's back when board assessment began, it started with very basic practices. You might call it housekeeping. Do board meetings start on time? Do we get the materials with enough time to review? Are the materials informative? Are directors prepared? Are we respectful? Those are great things, and those are important to assess. But oftentimes they're sort of like the base case of board effectiveness and not necessarily some of the bigger items. So as board assessment evolved, they added board leadership, where you would assess the chair or the lead director, you would assess the chairs of committee. And, board leadership has really grown in its responsibilities, both for communicating with investors at times, as well as working with management. So assessing board leaders is really valuable in terms of helping them hone their performance. Individual members, this is one that has gotten a lot of, had pushback early on, but I think it's now a standard. I think 80% of publicly listed boards do individual member assessment. And then the last one here is the agenda, which you might say is sort of part of basic practices, but this is more like the topics of what is the board really there to cover? What are and oftentimes an assessment, I'll repeat this later, should drive the board to say, hey, we've been spending a lot of time on these things that management has put in front of us, but we really need either more education or more time to really discuss these other topics we believe to be critical to the future of the enterprise. So looking at the agenda, which is really what is the task of the board, is really vital and valuable in terms of what to assess. So how to assess, it's moved from surveys, and much more common now are interviews and observations, and just recently have had so many experiences that really underscore the value of the interview and also observation by a third party. But interviews really can get at some of the context that a survey question may not be able to get at, and it can uncover some of the things that are most actionable for the board. And I know that certainly if it's not a member of the board doing the assessment, which it often is, it's the non-executive chair or lead director, then having a third party observe the board can really provide data about how the board is interacting that may be very insightful for the board to reflect on. And then finally, by whom? As I mentioned, I think 80% of the Fortune 500 have their assessments done by a non-executive chair or lead director. Then that's sometimes supplemented by general counsel involvement, and then third party, which is 15% or so, and those are often the lawyers who are advising the board. So let's try another poll real quickly. If we can go to the next page, let's see how this one works. So just a quick question. What do you actually assess? Are you just assessing the basics? And the board that you thought about for the last question, would it be board basics, board leadership, board members, and agenda content and emphasis? So choose all that apply. There we go.
And Elise, as we're waiting for the results to come in a little bit, I think one of the interesting things that I've seen, and I'd like to get your view on, is we have also seen some experimentation with using surveys, but not doing them on a 1 to 5 kind of scale. Simply, this is an essay. This becomes an essay question exam, so to speak. And then in connection with that, the who conducts it is, if it is going, you can do a Survey Monkey even, but if it's going to somebody who you view as totally neutral in the situation, not necessarily board, the lead director, not necessarily the chair, it could even be a trusted let's call it a universally trusted person who runs HR or something like that. They can be the ones to do the distillation. So for example, if you have individual feedback going, this is an important way of trying to get that feedback to people without saying, oh, everybody knows, or the lead independent director, has an influence here in a way that they shouldn't. Any views on what you see going on with sort of the more, it's not quite an interview, but let's call it the written techniques even?
I think actually written techniques are super helpful. I mean, you still have, and there becomes a challenge with anonymity only in that at the end of the day, you do kind of want this to facilitate and improve board dialogue. And in a survey environment, there may be no way to trace it back to who said what, which can be fine and may encourage commentary that you wouldn't get otherwise. But you it also is beneficial if there's somebody who's handling it a little more personally and can have a sense of the source of that feedback. But I would say the qualitative and the written essay is a very helpful add, because again, the survey can get you some, perspectives, but it's hard to know what people are using to anchor the surveys. So I do think that's a good approach. Now let's just look.
That's a results for you there, which is poll 3 showing 31%, 23%, 20%, and 26% on those numbers. So that's fairly balanced. But I think maybe if we can get poll 4 going.
And I'm actually interested because my assumption is that they aren't necessarily exclusive. So you might have one person is reporting that they're do board basics and board leadership and board members and the agenda. But it would. That doesn't correspond with the numbers that you see if you look at the results from some surveys of large corporations. You probably get more like 80% on all of them. Who conducts your board assessment?
Yeah, and so here's what's interesting, that what showed up there is that 52% are at the board leader level. 18% is some level of management support, such as a general counsel. The third party, or the lawyers, I should say, get 8%, and third party gets 22% at this point.
Yeah, that sounds about right. The only, let's move forward to then. We're going to skip the last one in the interest of time.
But before you do that, you want to say a word about what your view on getting executive management input onto board performance?
We do have a view. I think that given that the board has to partner so closely with management, it's really worthwhile getting that perspective. And there's definitely there's almost always insight to be gained when you get perspective from management. It doesn't necessarily mean it's it doesn't necessarily create an imperative, but it gives the board a good sense of how it's seen, and also some very small course corrections it can make. So, for instance, a very recent board assessment, it just turned out that the lead director, who in the spirit of trying to be a leader of the board, was taking up a lot of the airtime. Not his intent, actually, just but when he received that feedback, which came more through management than from his board peers, he was able to adapt his approach to give more time for others to speak and share some of their perspectives on the state of the company and critical actions. And it was actually super positive. And it was just one of those things he would not have gotten that feedback were there not an assessment, and it would have remained a blind spot and would have remained an opportunity for underperformance that's easily correctable. So we definitely advocate getting executive management's point of view, especially as there's so much filtration, there's so much connection now between management and the board. So let's go on to the next two. We have 2 slides left, and we have a few minutes before we want to throw it open. Just quickly, this is reflecting lessons learned from the fires. The theory of the case is that if you can assess all of these, you'll get a higher benefit and yield in the terms of insights and action. And just to underscore the point that the point is action. Just doing an assessment to say, well, we did it because we have to, is not the goal of a good assessment. The goal of a good assessment is to get insight on performance and see what and where you may be able to take action. And we've seen good actions like having an impact on the agenda, minimizing PowerPoint time, clarifying relationships with management, clarifying relationships with investors. But basically, when boards started out, they did the basic assessment, then they did leadership, then they did agenda setting, and at last they did member assessment, where there was a pretty much resistance to this, and there still is in many places where it's the norm. And back to the Blue Ribbon Commission report, they do say that the affinity bias is one of the biases you'll see in boards. And the affinity bias in colloquial language is sort of the gentleman's club, where we don't offend people. We're highly respectful, and I would never want to tell any of my peers that they're doing anything amiss. That builds camaraderie, but it also doesn't provide that feedback loop that we talked about in the beginning. So this is says that the greater the scope, the more the yield, but there's an experience curve. And for a board that's just starting out with assessment, I would not recommend starting with member assessment because it often can backfire. Next slide. I'm happy to share more of some of the outcomes of the actions boards have taken as a result of assessment. But let's start with the first takeaway, which is basically we argue that the chair has to champion board assessment, because if not the chair or lead director, whom, to make sure that there's a culture that's fit for purpose, to drive continuous improvement in what we call a maturational process, right? So maybe year one is you're just looking at leadership and the basics, and over time you can build a more robust assessment. But it also helps you to take advantage of the collective intelligence and team wisdom of the board, and particularly, as Rob was mentioning, the write-in, that will help a lot. And then using data collection as a counterweight to the sort of natural information asymmetry faced by boards. And whether the asymmetry is that management knows much more than the board, or whether it's that some members of the board know much more than other members of the board, it helps create kind of a level playing field when the information is shared with the full board. So the next insight, is that you should definitely use the assessment to lead improvements. Back to, I'll just move on from that because I've made that point already. That is the point. It should be a closed loop learning action process. So just, again, you may get an insight, you don't have to act on it, but that insight in and of itself gives you better ability to manage the context in which the board is working. The next one, the chair should evaluate their own effectiveness, but we would argue that every now and then the chair should have a third party evaluated. And there's definitely situations where a chair may have a blind spot or a lead director may have a blind spot. And in fact, one of the most frequent reasons we are called in is that the lead director or the chair is not in sync with the full board, and there's an opportunity to improve their alignment. And continuing on, I'd say director evaluation should be done annually. That's regulated for some, that's optional for others, but we believe it's a good practice. And when you do it several times, you can improve on the practice. So there's a benefit. There's the muscle memory that comes from doing it over again. And that if you do have individual individual assessment, you should give the individual feedback and have some discussions about how their performance on the board is being viewed. And then finally, two last points that we already made: management opinions should be solicited, ideally a minimum of 5 C-suite executives. And then this is sort of an old rule of thumb. The last one is use a third party at least every 3 years, simply because, it's sort of like culture is surrounding you and you don't always know what the culture is because you're so acclimated to it. But a third party can come in and point out aspects of the culture that may not be evident to those who are living in it. So with that, I want to wrap up and see what other questions there might be, or have a discussion and dialogue with Robert and Ryan to talk about how you might be able to use some of these to help the boards you're serving.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Elise. I really appreciate you, Ryan, and Robert for taking time to go through a lot of this stuff. We could talk about this, I'm sure, for another hour or two. And we have had a couple of questions come in, so I want to make sure we save some time. The first one that has come in is there a recommendation for how long a board member should serve on a particular committee? So I'm going to toss it over to you all and see what you think.
I mean, I don't think I'll pass this to Rob quickly because I'm sure he has an insight on this, but, I don't think there's a hard, fast rule. Obviously, as Rob said, from a totality of board service, I know ISS has put in some rules and regulations around how long individuals should sit on boards. Rob alluded to earlier in the UK, it's 9 years. Again, I think 3-year kind of bites potentially on committee is where I would generally see maybe a time to maybe move to that next committee. I don't know if it's a hard, fast rule. It really depends on the company, the culture, of that board. But Rob, any insights from your perspective?
I mean, I think you hit it actually, Ryan. It is the lawyer's answer of it depends. And in particular, that's true because you have certain areas of expertise. We put people on the board because they really are audit committee wizards. And now to say, gee, you've done a great job on that, we're going to move you off there and put you in NomGov or vice versa. I think either creates a little bit of may create uncertainty, if not panic, in the hearts of certain individuals. So it is what's right for, we're back to, the derivative third question, which is how do we put, what does our board culture dictate? What does our board size dictate? You don't want to over committee your people if you got a relatively small board. You don't want to have too many reports because otherwise your board meeting is filled with nothing but committee reports. So there is a balancing act here, and it really comes about in questions like who's on the committee and for how long. And I wish I could give you a better answer than that.
Well, I might add into that quickly that I know, and I get this from the nonprofit experience I've had, where there's kind of a norm of 3 years, particularly for chairs of committees. And that you kind of the first year, you're learning your role. The second year, you're going to get good steam. And then by the third year, you're ready to do it well and pass it on. And so I think that because the committee chairs can be a heavy lift, that would be a good norm to adopt. However, as Robert said, if you have a great audit committee chair, you're not going to swap them out for somebody who is not qualified to do that role.
Right.
All right. So we have another question that's just come in. Can board evaluations be used in legal cases against the board? Oof.
The lawyers will say no.
Yeah.
I believe. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, please, Elise, go ahead.
Well, I do not have a defined professional sanctioned answer by this, but I do think we've learned a lot lately about what is discoverable, including texts and emails. And even if your lawyer is copied, there's a lot of play in terms of what people can get access to. So, yes, I think that it's probably wise to consider that any documentation could be discoverable. But at the same time, usually the documentation shows a board doing its job diligently. So I personally have found that the rewards are far higher than the risks. I don't know, Robert, what's your answer?
The final one comes from something right in the news right now. And a few minutes before this call started, had the chance to read the behind the scenes on what was going on the board at University of Pennsylvania over these past few days. And I think the answer is one that, whether it's discoverable or not, there are ever fewer secrets in this world. And I think one has to assume that it could be, but at the same time, if you're behaving with integrity, you're perfectly happy to have that there.
Right.
All right. So I think that was the last that we have time for. Just a reminder to everyone that if you submitted a question, one of our friends over at Perlmutter will get back to you over the next couple of days. So don't fret. We will get back to you. But I just wanted to send a reminder out to everyone before we conclude the program. First, I want to remind everyone to join us in the next of our compensation webinar series that will be happening on February 27th, 2 p.m. Keep an eye on the websites, and you'll see this the information on our nacd.org/webinar page coming soon for registration. If you want to find this or any of our other NACD webinars, remember that you can always visit our archives, nacdonline.org/webinars. And for the ones that we do with Perlmutter, they're also available on Perlmutter website, the website that you see here below. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to remind you that if you, there are no more slides. So if you wanted to maintain your fellowship or certification, you are getting the 1 credit just by participating in this webinar. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. And I just want to take this time to thank Rob, Ryan, Elise for this amazing presentation, for taking time out during your very, very busy schedules. And just also wish everybody happy holidays, happy new year. And thank you for taking time out with us. All right. Don't forget to fill out those evaluations, and we look forward to seeing you again in the new year. Have a great one.